So I want to tell you a bit more about my experience of writing a series. When I first wrote Maisie Dobbs, I was writing a story that was in my head. I mean, that's what you're doing all the time. You're writing a story that's in your head. But I didn't envisage myself writing a series. It didn't even enter my head. I just had this story. It had come to me, and I very much wanted to write it. Well, I was very fortunate. I got an agent, and then I got a publisher. And it was when I sort of saw my manuscript for the last time, my editor phoned me and said, well, Jackie, let's talk about the next book in the series. And I thought, right, let's have that conversation, maybe tomorrow. And I quickly put her off, and I went back to a file that I had kept while I was writing. And let me tell you about this file. As I was writing Maisie Dobbs, and I kind of knew where the book was going, I kept, every now and again I'd write a scene or something would come to me that I knew didn't fit, or it was an aspect of Maisie's life that I thought does not fit. And instead of just deleting, I was putting it all in a file marked fragments. This probably goes back to the fact that I come from a family that doesn't throw anything away. So I went with this question, what comes next? I went to my fragments file because it was the only place I could think to go in a panic. And I printed out each paragraph or each scene that I had put away, and I set them before me. And I realized that I had the kindling for probably another 6 books right there. Now, not the whole story, the kindling. Well, I don't know, some of you might have been here a few years ago when I spoke about where stories come from, and the fact that, you have perhaps the kindling, which is an idea or something you've read, a family story or whatever, which is the kindling for what becomes your story. But it's waiting for a bit more fuel. It's waiting for something else to bring it to life. And I had this kindling, and I took the first one, the first paragraph, and was able to put together Birds of a Feather. And I realized this story sort of, if you will, came to me and really just bloomed in my mind from basically a lesson from school when I was 11. And so it was when my teacher told us about seeing a young man given a white feather in the war. And I can always remember, it stayed with me because I remember thinking how cruel, because the young man had in fact been seriously wounded already in battle. I looked at the mystery as being that archetypal journey through chaos to resolution, and the resolution doesn't always happen there and then, because I think that is you really see character when you take someone through chaos. And I realized that what I wanted to do, not only with the character of Maisie Dobbs, but with those people that pepper her life, was to take them through time. That I wanted there not only to be an arc of the story, the book that I was writing, but I wanted there to be an arc over the entire series, so that in a way it's like a saga, if you will, if you put it all together. I remember fairly early on in my writing career, I think it was when Maisie Dobbs had just been published, I went to an event where there were quite a few writers speaking. And Lee Child said, and he confessed he wasn't the first person to say it, although I don't know who was the first person to say this, that a reader comes back to a series, particularly a mystery, if you will, not to find out what the sleuth has done with the case, but what has the case done to the sleuth. And I think that is particularly true of my characters. I want to know, because we are all impacted. We're impacted by a bad day at work, but we're definitely impacted by the events of our day. And I wanted to see that. I love that place where the archetypal mystery, if you will, meets history. And remember that this was someone's present day, and what was it like to live in that time. There has been several times in the past when the books have been what they call optioned by a production company. That's the process that these things go through. Luckily it's gone down the river a little bit from there, but about a year ago, just over a year ago, the books were optioned by a brand new production company in the UK. I was very pleased with my, let's say, discussions with them, because their vision of Maisie Dobbs, it absolutely mirrors mine. And you know, it's a process you have to go through to make a TV series, which I'm now far more au fait with than I ever was in the past. And it's going forward, it would seem. I don't know the when and the if. And thank you. And as my mother always used to say, there's many a slip twixt cup and lip. So one to remember, I think. If anything, Maisie is inspired by the generation of women who came of age during the Great War, because I think they were an extraordinary generation of women. They were the first generation of women in Britain to go to war in modern times in very significant numbers, and it changed their lives completely. Just to give you an example, I know some of you have heard this before, but in 1921, the British government announced that, and it was in the papers and so on, a paper was written about it, that there were 2 million, quote unquote, surplus women. And in fact, a paper was written, The Problem of the Surplus Women. And the women that were sort of the darlings of the Great War, because they went to war in such a big way, you know, were suddenly the women that, well, they're going to cause trouble, because, you know, they do not have the gentling hand of a man upon them, so to speak. I was, I guess, influenced by the women I knew, because on my street there were 4 women who, when I was growing up, a very small community, and they were each Miss. And I was the only child on the street when we moved there. I guess I was 3 years old. And they were all, as I say, definitely ladies of a certain age. I was often invited to tea. And I realized much later, when this became more of an academic, I suppose, interest to me, that one of the tragedies of that generation of women is that they didn't have children. And so for so many of them, that's why so many of them went into teaching, for example. That's a way you can bring children into your life. And so I was often invited to tea. And my mum, you know, realized, I think, that, you know, that this was a generation of women whose last intimate experience of childhood was their own in an Edwardian era. And so, you know, I always went around with the best dress, you know, my little patent shoes and everything, and would sit there with my boiled egg sandwiches or whatever. And for each one of them, there was a sepia photograph of a young man lost to war. But there is an excellent book for anyone that's interested, and it's called Singled Out.
Yes.
Published, I want to say, about 10 or so years ago, 10, 12 years ago, by Virginia Nicholson. And it's about the way, I think that was there's the book that I wish I had have written myself. Process, you know, it's my job. Being a writer is my job. I'm a professional writer. So, as one author once said, 9 to 5, you know, 5 days a week. I'm not that prescriptive, but I generally do I write first thing in the morning, then I take a break, and then in the afternoon I'll come back and do more research or administration. There's a lot of administration that goes with the business of being a writer. Everything from dealing with, you know, websites and so on to, you know, emails back and forth to librarians and archivists and so on and so forth. But you know, it's a full working day. In terms of process, I do not revise as I go along. I'm not a believer in doing that. I think you can absolutely trip yourself up. I believe there's 2 distinct, or more than 2 distinct parts of being a writer. And when I do my first draft, I just want to get my story down. I'm in full story mode, and I'm creating stories and characters. When I go back in to do a revision, and when I was first a writer, I thought a revision was you hit the spell check. And my books are not usually heavily edited, really, because I've done quite a lot of work in my head before I even start writing. But when I go back in, I'm a different person. I'm a reader. I'm trying to be an advocate for the reader. without losing the story. But I'm, you know, I change names, for example. I think, no, that cannot possibly be a Lionel. He's definitely a Stephen. And I do a global change, and I'm checking certain of my facts or how I've used them. And also I'm checking for things like rhythm in the book. And I'm very careful with research. I do a lot of research, but I actually believe that research is like an iceberg. Only about 7% of it should be visible above the surface. I am a writer of fiction. I'm a storyteller. I'm not writing narrative nonfiction. But I always say to writers that you should just trust that your research will inform every word. You don't have to get it in there just because you found it out, you know? But, you know, once I get into my book, once I get into my story, I could be on another planet. That's where I am. That's where I reside when I'm writing. I reside in my story. And you have to be able to write anywhere.
What is your biggest challenge when you sit down to begin your next book?
Sitting down, beginning my next book. It's actually, it terrifies me. It absolutely terrifies the life out of me. I sit there and I think, I am never going to be able to do this again in my life. And then, you know, you just have to do it. I mean, you just have to get stuck in. And usually there's a point at which I know I'm really hooked into it, and that happens between 50 and 100 pages.
How do you write it without, with you know, peppering it with the clues without giving it away? Is that a difficult process?
I don't even think about it.
Okay.
I do not even think about it. If I think too much about that, I'll drive myself crazy. I just write the story that's in my head. I just write the story. And it comes together organically. And sometimes it doesn't quite come together, but, you know, when I've done a first draft, all a first draft is the clay on the wheel. Then I have to go back in. I think, you know what? I think I gave too much away there. Whip that out. And sometimes it could be just 2 words. You know, it could be a name. But mostly I just have to trust the process. And we have so much to learn from generations past, and the values, their values and their strengths, and indeed what they learned from their weaknesses. I think it's just great fun, and I think you know, I'm going to I guess try and reach out to a very broad spectrum in terms of age and so on, because I like to bring history alive.